people who have hired a private investigator, what shocking secret did you find out? Story 1. I didn't hire one, but my crazy, abusive ex did. A few months after we started dating, I felt like I was being watched and saw the same car following me. He said I was crazy, but then a year later he said, "You know how you thought you were being followed when we first dated? I hired a private investigator." He seriously thought it was so funny. I was shocked and pissed off because I wasn't doing anything untrustworthy. I asked if he found anything, and he replied, "Oh yeah, they said you went shoe shopping when you told me you were grocery shopping. You were totally lying." But I spent the next 2 years trying to leave the emotionally and physically abusive relationship. He threatened to burn my family's house down or off me if I did. I finally managed to plan and execute a safe escape, but he stalked and harassed me afterward, and I had to get a restraining order. I kept feeling like I was being watched, and the cops had to warn him, but he claimed hiring a private investigator wasn't a breach of the restraining order and that he had a right to know what I was doing. He also told me he hired a private investigator to check up on a teacher who once laughed at him and said he couldn't wait until she died to piss on her grave. Before we continue, do us a quick favor, smash that like button and subscribe to support our channel. Story 2. My dad was cheating on my mom with 2 different older men. Neither of them knows about the other. He says he isn't gay or anything. He's doing it for the money. He told us he's in their wills and that they're just friends. I don't believe it. How do you end up in a friend's will? There's definitely something else going on, but he won't admit it. My mom calls him El Beware as a code word for him. It means the vulture in Spanish. Seen it. When I said, "How do you end up in a friend's will?" I meant someone you just met. Not best friends or anything. They just met, and my dad already moved in and is in his will. I understand putting close friends in wills if you don't have kids or very little family. Story 3. I had to hire one to help gather evidence to defend myself against an assault charge. The story goes like this. My ex attacked me in front of a witness. I didn't know, stole my phone, and then called the cops on me. I got arrested, and while I was in jail, she wiped my phone and stole some incriminating evidence from my place. After I got out, I hired a private investigator to try to track down the witness. The Friday before a Tuesday trial, I finally found the guy and had the private investigator go talk to him to avoid any claims of witness tampering. The guy refused to get involved, so I thought I was screwed. My ex is this tiny little girl who plays the victim a little too well. I called up my lawyer to accept the plea deal. It turns out the prosecutor had barely spoken to my ex until that day. Due to fortunate timing, the prosecutor met with her before my lawyer could. Once they did, the prosecutor realized she was completely deranged, and during that meeting, she admitted to having attacked me multiple times that night, effectively destroying any case they had. I got the call, all charges dropped. It was the most relief I've ever felt in my life. The weird thing is, the private investigator didn't directly help with the case, but working with him to find the witness kept me from accepting the crappy plea deal just long enough for things to work themselves out. Story 4. I didn't hire the private investigator. A friend did to check if her husband was cheating on her since he was flirting with a girl they both worked with. This caused many arguments. The private investigator used a huge zoom lens and got very explicit images of the husband having outdoor banging session with the girl. Somehow, the wife forgave him. They are still together. Story 5. I have a story about private investigators doing a hilariously crap job. So years ago, my brother injured his back at work because of his employer's unsafe work practices. During the ensuing lawsuit, my brother's lawyer was given a folder full of documents from the employer's legal team. Turns out, they had hired a private investigator to investigate my brother to prove that his injury was faked. Well, unfortunately, the private investigator had been taking pictures of me operating an all-terrain vehicle mounted leafhopper. My brother walked into the court hearing and watched the color drain from the opposing lawyers' faces when he introduced himself, looking nothing like me. Story 6. Not me, but a friend hired a private investigator because he was suspicious. His stepdad was cheating on his mom. So, he asked me, and I put him in touch with a guy I knew. A bit of backstory. The stepdad is 5 feet 10 inches, about 160 pounds. My friend is 6 feet 2 inches, 235 pounds, ripped. When my friend was 15 and his mom and stepdad started dating, he gave the classic "you hurt her, you're dead" speech. Also, his biological dad walked out on him and his sister when my friend was around 4. It took a while, but my friend warmed up to the stepdad, and he's a good guy, took my friend and me to a 49ers game once, which was pretty cool. Anyway, the private investigator said the stepdad wasn't cheating. Apparently, there was a house on the market that my friend's mom wanted, and he bought it. He'd been remodeling it for some time and kept it a secret. As a 5-year anniversary gift to her, he bought it. Now they live in a 5-bedroom house. Story 7. My story is a little different. I had a private investigator investigate me. About 6 years ago, I became very ill with a variety of issues that left me quite poorly. I was an optician, so using my hands with arthritis was never going to work. I applied for disability support in the UK, sailed through, and started receiving a monthly payment. Fast forward a few years, I got restless at home and retrained for a job that didn't involve my hands. I stopped receiving the full disability money, except for the benefit you can get while working. I used it to pay off a better automatic car. Well, my very nasty mother's friend saw me start work and called the benefits office, assuming I was still claiming full benefits. Unfortunately, she exaggerated and told them I was living a normal life and even running daily. So the benefits office filmed and watched me, thinking they had an "aha! Gotcha!" moment. Their private investigator provided photos of me walking unaided. When I sat in the meeting with a room full of smug fraud officers and my solicitor, I felt sick to my stomach. I really couldn't figure out what the heck was going on. They were trying to make it look like I'd been running and jogging, but I knew I never walked more than 5 meters to my car. Anyway, the solicitor pointed out the photos were just screenshots from a video and asked for the full videos. The videos showed me struggling to walk. In one, I was resting on my car before opening the door. I was going into a supermarket and had replaced my cane with the trolley to lean on. You get the picture. So, the fraud team basically said, "Loops," and I never heard from them again. I spend a lot of time trying to appear normal, and it bit me in the ass. Also, never trust those fraud TV shows anymore. Edit. For those asking, I no longer speak with my mother, so I am not sure if she's still friends with that lady. Honestly, I think she was brainwashed into believing anyone who claims benefits must be scummy. I am doing well. Thank you for asking. I started methotrexate last year, and it seems to be keeping me quite steady. Story 8. My dad got my mom pregnant when she was 15. Her dad forcibly put the child up for adoption. Nobody ever talked about it, but I found out because my dad became an alcoholic who would black out and talk about what was bothering him. He couldn't handle the losses of his oldest son, my mom cheating on him, and the death of my little sister. My now ex-wife decided she wanted to find my older brother, but my paternal grandfather wouldn't cooperate. She asked my mom for as many details as she could. I was against looking for him because he probably didn't know he was adopted, and I didn't want to mess that up for him. After she got my parents' hopes up, I agreed to hire a private investigator. The next day, we had pictures of a guy who looked like my uncle, a website for a small company he founded, and links to his profile for many high-profile jobs he'd held. We found out he'd been adopted by a college professor at what I'd call the Harvard of the Midwest. The guy had a good life, much better than he would have had otherwise. I gathered the private investigator's report, pictures of his biological family, and some medical information that might be useful, then sent him a package via certified mail. He never responded. Years later, I found out he was divorced around that time, so I thought maybe his ex-wife hadn't given him the information. I joined Facebook just to find him. He was there with pictures, so I knew it was the same guy. I sent him a private message explaining who I was, why I was contacting him, and why he had been put up for adoption. I added a request that he at least tell me to go to hell or something, so I could have some closure for my parents. His page went private, and I never heard from him. My mom died a few years ago. She was glad to know he was well and successful, but never got to meet him. My dad is doing very well now, but I know it still eats away at him. Story 9. I was a private investigator for a little bit. Most of the work private investigators do involves searching financial and court records and serving documents, but one time, wealthy parents paid me to stake out their college senior daughter who had stopped returning their calls. They were worried about her. These parents spent about $40,000 on round-the-clock monitoring, only to find out their daughter had dropped out of school and was living as a full-time ski bum. By the way, stakeouts mostly just mean sitting in your car reading all day. Story 10. We had a babysitter we suspected was stealing from us. Luckily, our neighbors were a private investigator couple, and they ran a background check for $10. The babysitter had a string of DUAs, and just days before a large fine was due, my camera disappeared. He also stole money from my kids' piggy banks. He kind of disappeared but was really into Instagram, so I secretly followed him. He started babysitting again for a single mom, an easy target, and posted lots of fun pictures with that family. I tracked down the mom and sent her a long email detailing his whole scam. She agreed we were right, and it was clear he'd been stealing from her business. He's since gone underground, but I still Google him regularly to see what he's up to. He's managed to avoid arrests for a while now. Story 11. Back in the 90s, my dad had a friend who owned a Renault Clio Williams. One day, someone stole his car, and it was later located in Athens. After reporting the theft to the police, he really wanted to get his car back because it was expensive. He hired a private investigator to find it. About a week later, the investigator called to say the car was at a junkyard outside Thessaloniki. My dad went there, found his car, and rushed to a police station to inform them of the location. Believe it or not, the officer told him not to mess with the junkyard owner. That junkyard was known for stealing cars and hoped my dad would just get his money back from insurance. Story 12. My grandfather once hired a private investigator to investigate my grandmother. While spying on her from his car, another investigator he knew suddenly came up to his window, frantically asking, "What are you doing here?" His response was, of course, "What are you doing here?" It turned out my grandmother was being investigated by the Drug Enforcement Administration for drug dealing. I don't know if anything ever came of it, but we're pretty sure that's why the old family barn was burned down. That woman is batshit crazy, and that's not even the wildest story I've heard about her. Story 13. I briefly worked for a private investigator when I was much younger, like 19. Getting the job was a funny story itself. I was walking past the office, which was in a tiny strip mall right in the middle of a residential neighborhood. On a whim, I decided to go in and see what a real PI's office looked like. It was pretty unremarkable, except for the huge biker sitting at the only desk wearing a polo shirt and slacks. We started chatting, and I asked if he was hiring. He laughed and asked what kind of work I expected. I told him, probably a lot of boring work sifting through papers in the library and courthouse. He laughed again. He did that a lot, and we called him Santa because of that and his white beard. Then he gave me the job. I worked there for 3 months. Mostly doing insurance work. That usually meant sitting in a car, reading a book, occasionally taking pictures of some guy in a neck brace or leg cast walking to or from his car, and 2 or 3 times snapping photos of a guy playing baseball or basketball in his backyard. But Santa also offered a reduced rate for tracking down biological parents, siblings, or children. We had one case where a woman in her 30s wanted to find her biological mom. We went through the usual routine, visiting courthouses, city halls, and libraries to track her down. We spent a whole month on it. We worked on other cases during that time, so it took a bit longer than usual. The woman didn't know her mother's name, only her adoptive parents, who had passed years ago. She also didn't have any adoption paperwork and didn't know where it might be filed. This was in the 90s, before everything was digital. I finally found the adoption paperwork in a courthouse in the next county over and got a name. I was running late. Santa didn't let me work overtime, so I had to drop off the copies at his office and leave. But before I could go, he stopped me, excited about the mother's name. It was his wife. His wife had given up a baby for adoption 30-something years ago. He called his wife, who dug up her copies of the additional paperwork from back then, and sure enough, it was a match. We called the client, who didn't answer, so we picked up Santa's wife and drove to the client's home. She was on the phone with her adopted sister, talking about our effort. The private investigator and his wife immediately bear-hugged the woman, who was very confused. Both were too emotional to speak, so I explained that the woman was her biological mom and the private investigator was her husband. It was a freaking beautiful scene. That memory is one of the things that's kept me from turning bitter over the years. It was enough to delay my then imminent loss of faith in God for another decade or so that these women had hired her biological mom's husband to find her biological mom. Story 14. My sister, in her mid-30s, is adopted and hired a private investigator to find her estranged biological father. They came back saying not only was he still alive and nearby, but he also had a daughter, meaning my sister had a biological sibling. Further digging uncovered that they weren't just similar in age, they were exactly the same age. The evidence suggested my sister had a twin, and her birth father had taken the twin and vanished. Huge, life-changing news. Eventually, through more detective work, the private investigator realized that the daughter was actually just my sister. There was no other sibling. They had been investigating my sister the whole time by accident. Needless to say, we asked for our money back. Story 15. I used to work for an insurance company that handled injury claims. More often than not, the investigator would find nothing or would provide us with video proving the claimant was indeed injured. We would then bury the video, of course. Occasionally, people exaggerate their injuries, but they are by far the minority. Those few cases tend to cast unfair suspicion on legitimately injured people. My favorite example was when the insurer sent me hours of footage following a young, healthy-looking, and quite physically fit man. The video showed him leaving his house, working outside on a home renovation, doing heavy lifting, and carrying things up and down ladders, all despite a reported back injury. The insurance adjuster was eager to take the case to trial without making any offers. Lo and behold, I watched the video, checked the claimant's age in the file, and thought to myself, this guy looks awfully young for someone in his 50s. 10 minutes of Facebook research later, I discovered the private investigator had been following the claimant's 25-year-old son for 2 weeks. The few cases of actual fraud make good stories that get told and retold, but in reality, the vast majority of claimants are honest, despite the insurance company Kool-Aid pushing otherwise. I spent a lot of time talking them down while doing that work. Story 16. This is so weird. My mom and I were literally talking about this today. Not me, but my family hired a private investigator. My grandpa had a younger brother, whom I will call John, who was always the black sheep of the family. Apparently, my grandpa was quite protective of John and would always defend him to family and friends, saying he was a good kid who would figure his life out eventually. One day, John asked my grandpa to loan him a couple $1,000s to buy a house, which was no small amount in the 60s, and after talking it over with my grandma, they eventually did. John skipped town shortly after that and never contacted my grandparents again. My grandpa, being the brooding Irishman he was, never really talked about John after that. In the 80s, one of my mom's cousins grew curious about what happened to John and hired a private investigator to look for him. They lived in a small town in northern British Columbia, Canada, and after a while the investigator found John living on the streets of Vancouver. My grandmother and great-aunt flew to Vancouver to see him because my grandpa still wanted nothing to do with it, to see if they could bring him home. My grandmother said that when they met John, he was livid, absolutely freaking livid, that they had found him. He was living with a small group of people who had become his little street family. He told them he was very happy with his life as it was, to leave, and to never try to contact him again. And that was that. My grandmother and great-aunt got back on a plane and flew home without him. To our family's knowledge, he lived out the rest of his days on the streets of Vancouver. Story 17. A very long 6-month story I will try my best to share. I was scammed out of over $50,000 for a business I wanted to purchase. The scammer faked tax returns, income statements, you name it, to make it all sound legit. He used fake names to hide his identity and a burner phone. I contacted my bank and told them what happened, and they said, "Tough crap," even though it was a wire transfer and I had proof of everything. I talked to a few police officer friends, and they said it was out of their jurisdiction and there wasn't really anything they could do. I emailed the Attorney General for my state, and he said he couldn't do anything because it was likely over state lines, so I needed to contact the U.S. Attorney General. I called the U.S. Attorney General's office, and the assistant told me I needed to talk to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, but I would more than likely not get my money back. I called the FBI, and they said I needed to file a report, but I would probably not hear anything about it. I posted online in a business group on Facebook and found an additional 7 people who were also scammed by the same person. One of them had audio recordings of their phone calls. The total loss was over $300,000. I hired an attorney to help me out and back me up legally. He said I needed to hire a private investigator to find this person. I posted online in a business group on Facebook and found an additional 7 people who were also scammed by the same person. One of them had audio recordings of their phone calls. The total scammed from just the 8 of us was over $300,000. The private investigator started doing their thing. Within 48 hours, they were able to identify him and provide me with phone numbers, addresses, business names, you name it. I gave all the information to my attorney and shared it with the other 7 people. I looked up the guy's name online, and he had gone to prison 20 years ago for running the same scam. He and 11 others were part of a mafia that scammed $6 million in 2 years. The ringleader also committed 6 counts of arson. My attorney got in contact with the scammer's attorney, and as of last week, I am receiving all my money back. And so are the other 7 individuals. I am truly disappointed that not one U.S. government agency seemed to care about any of this. Story 18. My grandmother's first boyfriend after my grandfather died claimed to be a retired cop and a veteran. They enjoyed dancing to country music together and even bought a new car in her name, though she can't drive anymore. My uncles hired a private investigator and found out that the old man had a habit of getting involved with widows and taking advantage of them financially. By the way, the boyfriend is not the private investigator. Story 19. I hadn't heard from my mom since I was about 15. She was very unstable due to drugs and alcohol. When I was 29, I decided it was time to find out what happened to her. I figured if she was a Jane Doe somewhere, I could put her to rest, and if she was alive, I wanted to let her know I forgave her. I hired a private investigator to help. I guess the private investigator was moved by my story because she also ran information on the man my mother was apparently married to in the house. With one clue from his report, I was able to track them down. I wouldn't have found my mom alive and just starting recovery after being homeless and addicted for many years if it wasn't for the private investigator who kindly ran an extra report for free. Mom has remained sober for about 7 years now and is probably the healthiest she's ever been physically and emotionally. Story 20. My oldest niece's dad married a controlling woman. She convinced him to take my sister to court for full custody of my niece, which stressed my sister so much that her water broke at 29 weeks. My parents hired a private investigator and found out that his wife was using electronic benefit transfer to buy groceries instead of the money he gave her. She was also getting prescriptions from 12 different doctors and involved in other messed up stuff. He contacted her parents, who he was told were dead. When he introduced himself, her dad immediately asked how much she'd taken from him. She wasn't the first man she'd done that to, and she wasn't using her real name. He ended up divorcing her, and she's currently serving time in prison for multiple charges. Story 21. My mother's dad walked out on my mom, my aunt, and my grandmother when mom was just 5. A few years later, my grandmother died from a grand mal seizure. Mom was taken in by her grandparents but always wondered why her dad left and what became of him. In her 40s, she saved up and hired a private investigator to track him down. It turned out he had moved over time from Pittsburgh to California, where he ended up in prison for armed robbery and other violent crimes. He died in San Quentin Penitentiary. I think Mom got a lot of closure from that. She saw that life probably would have been even worse if he had stayed. At least living with her grandparents, she was loved and raised to fulfill her potential. Story 22. I know someone who worked as an assistant to a private investigator. She basically went to bingo with a camera in her purse to capture video of a woman who claimed a car accident had completely immobilized her. But the woman would take off her neck brace all the time and play bingo for hours on end. Nothing exciting, just catching fraud. Story 23. Not me, but my grandfather did. He was separated from his brother when the Japanese occupied China. My grandfather safely made it to Hong Kong and eventually to Canada. According to family friends back then, his brother made it to Singapore or Malaysia. So, my grandfather spent about 5 years working with a private investigator to find his brother so they could be reunited. Sadly, with only a picture and the fact that many people died in the war, there wasn't much to go on. My grandfather is still alive and always thinks of his brother. It's his wish to see him one more time. To let you know, my grandfather worked with this private investigator many years ago, roughly between 1999 and 2004, with a few check-ins here and there after that. My grandfather was disheartened because he made many trips to Asia over the years thinking, this is it, but it only cost more money and raised his hopes. There's no clue if his brother married, if he even made it to Singapore or Malaysia, or if he ended up outside Asia altogether. We're not even sure if he's still alive. He'd be in his late 80s now, roughly estimated. He hasn't spoken about it directly with me, only with my mom, his daughter. To be honest, we haven't really encouraged him to keep searching. All my aunts and uncles tell him to move on and enjoy his time in peace instead of living in constant yearning. I don't have the standing in the family to overstep my mom and her siblings by bringing up the past or suggesting a DNA kit. If I were to do that, I'd have to do it secretly and carefully consider the emotional investment my grandfather might make. He's not living unhappily by any means. He has a great life and is quite accomplished, having raised 6 kids who now have families and homes of their own. We each take care of him. He has tons of friends, enjoys cooking, uses WeChat to keep in touch with everyone, traveled before COVID, and likes to read. He does want to see his brother, but as time goes by, the memory and drive grow fainter, and day-to-day life makes it easier for him to accept the circumstances. Story 24. A private investigator tried to contact me about my father a few years ago. She was extremely rude and pushy, intimidating my sweet mother by showing her a pistol she carried on her waistband. She called me once, yelling and demanding to know why I was hiding from her, even calling me by my father's name. It took her 5 minutes to pause long enough for me to explain who I was. I warned her that if she ever threatened my mother again, I was just as armed and would call an actual police officer to handle her. She never bothered us again. Story 25. When I met my wife, she seemed to have a normal modern family, 2 moms, 2 dads. Over time, it became clear her stepdad wasn't around much. Holidays, birthdays, you name it. He'd pop in to say hi, grab a nap, then take off again. My wife's family thought this was normal, just the way it had always been since they were teenagers. He claimed to have a job following FedEx trucks around the state to prevent theft and drug trafficking. But I thought it was strange and started joking that he had another family. Well, I guess it got my sister-in-law thinking because she has a contact with a private investigator at her law firm. Sure enough, he didn't have just 2 but 3 wives around the state, with 5 other stepchildren between them. My sister-in-law broke the news to her mother, who immediately changed the locks and filed for divorce. They never spoke again. Cold turkey. The divorce was even uncontested. As family members, they also sent the report to his other wives. Edit to answer some questions. Yes, polygamy is illegal, but it's rarely prosecuted except to make examples of people. I don't know if my mom in denial was his first wife or not. I do know that one of the wives had married and divorced him between their marriages. How does it happen? Counties don't exactly share marriage records. His families were pretty far apart. Was their wedding legal? No idea, I am not a lawyer. Probably the separation was just a formality for paperwork, which is why it went to court, was uncontested, and he never showed up again. I think he reached out once or twice, but she never answered. If he ever showed up again, we weren't told about it. My mom in denial is a strong, independent woman of faith who just didn't know. He fooled his stepdaughters for 15 years too. Story 26. On the other end of the private investigator spectrum, 13 years ago, I was in a bad car accident. I was rear-ended at a red light by a lady going 45 miles per hour. Most of my injuries were soft tissue damage, except for an issue with my temporomandibular joint. Fast forward 8 years. Finally, my court day arrives to see if I'd get $90,000 in damages. They show camera footage from 4 years earlier, just 3 days of me pushing a grocery cart, carrying groceries, and talking on the phone. Apparently, that's enough to prove I am fine. Present day. Every morning my hands go numb. It takes me 3 days to clean one room. I can't braid my hair. Many other tasks take me way longer than any normal 41-year-old. Sometimes you do things just to feel normal, not like you're a 90-year-old woman. Story 27. Not a private investigator story, but my girlfriend's mother wanted to find an old British boyfriend from her youth. This was before Facebook and such, and he was an older man with no online presence. I managed to track him down through one of his daughters. When we tried to contact him, he was elusive and suspicious and didn't believe me at first. When they finally met, he explained he had received a lot of harassment for his beliefs. It turned out he was a Holocaust denier and had written a book about it. My girlfriend's mother concluded that sometimes it's better to leave things in the past. Story 28. My boyfriend's family hired a private investigator to do some covert genealogy because, although they're white, they all have thick, wiry hair that only black hairdressers can handle. There are things older folks around here just don't talk about. It turns out there's a fair amount of lumber Indian heritage, a community founded by disenfranchised Native Americans and escaped slaves back in the day, in my boyfriend's family, which explains the hair. Story 29. I was the recipient of a private investigator's surveillance. One day, I came home from work and my boyfriend asked for my engagement ring, saying he wanted to take it to be professionally cleaned. The moment he had it, he accused me of cheating. The conversation went back and forth for ages. I was beside myself, I couldn't believe what he was saying, and he refused to believe I was innocent. He then told me he'd had me followed for 6 weeks by a private investigator who had seen me get into a red Mini. It was a girl I knew giving me a lift to work, but he wouldn't believe me. I knew then it was over. I packed my things and left. I told him to get in touch with the private investigator and have them review the so-called evidence that I was cheating. An hour later, he showed up where I was staying, begging to have me back. He'd realized his mistake. There was no way I was going back to someone who behaved that way, so we parted ways. Story 30. I used to work for an insurance defense firm years ago. The best private investigator story I have is when we hired one to tail a man suing our client for an injury that wasn't entirely our client's fault. The man refused to settle and insisted on going to trial, even though we offered a fair sum that would have covered his medical bills. The investigator obtained photos showing the plaintiff was nowhere near as injured as he claimed, but the crown jewel was a picture of the man walking on a pier with a woman who wasn't his wife, his hand on her behind. Later, during a deposition, the attorney slid the picture to the plaintiff and said, "Mr. Smith, obviously not his real name, who is the woman in this picture. We would like to schedule a deposition with her as well." The man went ghost white and told his attorney he wanted to settle. At least he was smart enough to realize that if his wife found out the other woman was going to be deposed, he would need a family law attorney too, because the divorce papers would likely follow. Edit to clarify some points from the comments. No, this is not technically blackmail. Our firm hired a private investigator to follow him to determine if he was faking his injuries, which is standard procedure, not to see if he was cheating on his wife. We had no idea he was doing that. The fact that the woman in the picture was his mistress was irrelevant. The attorney would have requested her contact information, even if she were just a friend, coworker, cousin, or anyone else. The attorney wanted to depose her to assess the extent of the man's injuries. At no point did the attorney say, "Drop the suit or we'll expose your affair to your wife." Story 31. My mom's best friend divorced her husband and was awarded full custody of their daughter. His family was a mess. He kidnapped his daughter, and he and his parents just disappeared. This was easier in 1977 than it is now. She tried hiring a private investigator but couldn't afford one. So she started learning how to trace people on her own in the days before the internet. She spent years doing this whenever she wasn't waitressing. She did find her daughter in 1981, but by that time her daughter had been turned against her. Mom's friend went on to get her private investigator license and worked as a private investigator specializing in women's issues for the next 2 decades. I don't know what happened to her after that. If she's alive, she would be in her 80s, I think. 1. Did mom and daughter reconcile? I asked my mother about that. She lost contact with her friend when mom left Texas over 20 years ago. The last she knew, no. They never reconciled. They communicated, that's it. 2. What about the police? As I explained in another comment, it was different in the 70s. Unlike now, it was easy to assume a new identity and get lost. It was hard to find people who didn't want to be found. The most popular method of assuming a new identity even became a plot point in the 1986 movie Highlander. Police usually considered kidnapping by a spouse to be a civil matter to be handled by the courts. It was a low priority for law enforcement. Amber Alerts weren't introduced until 1996. Before that, missing children were highlighted in other ways, such as appearing on milk cartons or being featured on television, especially on shows like America's Most Wanted. Edit. Amber Alerts began in 1996. Prior to that, high-profile cases like Adam Walsh brought national attention to missing children, helping raise awareness through media rather than immediate, coordinated alerts. Story 32. In his 20s, my partner hired a private investigator to find out what had become of the childhood bully who had made his life hell and who had vowed to off him. The bully had actually tried once by bringing a loaded gun to school, but another student reported it. The bully was expelled but remained in the neighborhood for a few more years, beating up my partner whenever he got the chance. The private investigator eventually found the bully living in a town more than an hour outside the city, working a dead-end job. He'd been arrested for assault and public drunkenness a couple of times. That information helped my partner move past the lingering fear that the guy would someday show up and make good on his threat. Story 33. My good friend was raised solely by her mom, who always told her that her father had walked out when she was a baby and had never wanted anything to do with her. That belief weighed heavily on her, and she struggled throughout her childhood carrying that pain. A couple of years ago, she decided to hire a private investigator to try and find him. Well, they did find him, and it turned out everything her mother told her was a lie. Her dad is honestly one of the kindest, softest-hearted people I've ever met. He didn't walk out, he was forced out. When he discovered her mother had been unfaithful, things unraveled. He wasn't her biological father, it turns out, but he had loved her like his own from the beginning. He only stayed away because her mother threatened him. She told him he had no legal rights to the child, and worse, she threatened to accuse him of essaying my friend as a baby if he ever tried to reach out. It broke him. But he never stopped hoping she'd find him one day. Thankfully, my friend is an adult now and has moved out of her mom's house. She's finally able to have the relationship with her dad that she always wanted. It just sucks that it took hiring a private investigator to get there. Edit. I talked to my friend to clarify some details. Apparently, the whole left when she was a baby thing was a bit of an exaggeration. He left when she was about 22 months old. He'd only found out she wasn't biologically his about a month before that. To be quite honest, I never questioned whether it might be strange for them to be so emotionally connected, because in his eyes, she is his daughter, and in her eyes, he's the dad she briefly had and was then cruelly denied for most of her life. They have a great relationship now, and she's gone no contact with her mom. Edit 2. Finding him involved tracking down the man whose name is on her birth certificate. That man is her dad, also known as not her biological father. Story 34. My grandma's older brother was kidnapped when he was under 10 years old. I can't remember exactly how old the state fair is, but it happened around that time. The family believed it was his uncle who took him. His dad had passed away early on, and his uncle wasn't happy that my great-grandma got custody, or that another man was raising his nephew. One day, we were sitting out on the back porch looking through old photo albums when we came across a picture of him. That's when my grandma told us the story of what happened. About 1.5 to 2 years later, my grandma's health went downhill. It had been over 60 years since her brother was kidnapped, and she was only a couple of months from passing. So, my mom and aunt hired a private investigator who actually managed to find him. He had been living in Brazil ever since he was taken and had built an entire family there. They got to reconnect over FaceTime, and my grandma got to meet a whole side of her family she never even knew existed. They talked on the phone and FaceTimed several times a week all the way up until she passed. Story 35. Not a private investigator myself, nor have I hired one, but I used to work in the office of a private investigator firm specializing in insurance fraud. My job was editing and sometimes writing surveillance and background investigation reports that we sent to our clients, mostly lawyers and insurance companies. One thing that never failed to surprise me was how many people claiming to suffer from severe disabilities regularly posted pictures or videos of themselves running marathons or building decks in their yards. I am comfortable saying that in at least half the cases I handled over 2 years, our clients flagged claimants as fraudulent because of social media. Disgruntled exes were also a significant source of tips. Here is an example of one of the more remarkable cases where social media saved the day. It was summer, and on the day of surveillance, our investigator spotted the claimant and his family loading their car with beach gear. The claimant drove for a couple of hours before the investigator eventually lost sight of the vehicle. Side note, tailing someone in a car without drawing suspicion or losing them is pretty tough. The investigator, too far from home to drive back, checked into a motel overnight. The next morning, he checked his phone and saw the claimant had checked in at a nearby location on Facebook. The investigator made a quick stop to buy swim trunks and a beach towel, then drove to the spot. What followed was hours of covert footage showing the claimant swimming in a wave pool, going down water slides, lifting and carrying his kids, basically doing things no one with a serious spine injury should be able to do. Story 36. My uncle disappeared without a trace in the 1990s. About a year after his daughter was kidnapped and killed, we hired a private investigator to track him down, but they found next to nothing. Since my uncle had developed a drug problem following my cousin's death, the best guess the private investigator had was that he either died from an overdose or took his own life, and that his body had either not been found or was reported as a John Doe. Imagine my family's surprise 2 decades later when my uncle called my mother, his only sibling. My grandfather had been on his deathbed for a month, and somehow my uncle found out. He arrived to make a show of paying his respects, hoping to get money from his parents. When it became clear he wasn't going to get anything, he took off once again. He never gave us a real or detailed explanation of why he left, where he'd been, or what he'd been doing. He left no address or phone number, and made no effort to stay in contact. The private investigator we hired must have been pretty lousy, or my uncle really knows how to disappear. Story 37. Not mine specifically, but my mother hired a private investigator to spy on the school. My little brother is dyslexic and has severe social anxiety, so he was struggling a lot in a public school setting. He had an individualized education program, which the teachers and principal insisted was being followed. Yet every day my brother would come home in tears, shaking because he felt abandoned and stupid. So, my mom hired the investigator, and sure enough, the teachers were basically just ignoring my brother. They'd sit him at the back of the room, demand he do his work, then wouldn't help him through it. When he couldn't complete it because of his dyslexia, they'd yell at him for not doing it again. With all the evidence, my mom arranged a meeting with the school board and threatened to sue. They agreed to pay his tuition for a private school that was supposed to help. It didn't, so Mom ended up pulling him out and homeschooling him. He's been doing a lot better since. Story 38. I found the description of a car that my sister was kidnapped in. Years ago, my sister, 15 years old at the time, was kidnapped from our home in the northeast of the US. She left a note saying she was leaving for a better life, but we didn't buy it. The note made her a runaway, so an Amber Alert, an announcement to everyone's cell phones about a missing minor, couldn't be activated since it wasn't technically a kidnapping. We hired a private investigator that my uncle knew. The investigator uncovered a string of deleted emails within 24 hours after her disappearance, describing the car she'd be picked up in from a guy we suspected could be her kidnapper. Let's call him Stan. To help paint a picture, Stan was 27 at the time of this incident. It should have ended there, but it didn't. Stan was at his home in Florida. The police went to his house, and there he was, just sitting there low-key. It turned out Stan had hired someone to come get my sister from our home and bring her to Florida for him, all under the promise to her that they'd live an amazing life together. Stan told this man that my family abused her and that it wasn't safe for her here. All lies to squash any doubt the hired man might have had. The driver was eventually spotted and tailed by 2 undercover vehicles. They waited until he pulled over for gas to approach the vehicle, not knowing if he was armed or willing to put up a fight. I got my sister back, and after years of therapy, she's now a functioning member of society with a totally cool significant other. I testified against Stan in federal court, and he was locked up 10 years ago. He still resides in a federal prison in Florida. It turns out he had coaxed my sister into trusting him for close to 2 years through an online game. That means it all started when she was just 13 and he was 25. What a disgusting trash can of a human. Story 39. I didn't hire him, but my mom did. My father is well over $20,000 in debt from not paying child support. He was known for living in another state and acting like I didn't exist. Although my aunt, his sister whom I've never met, wants something to do with me. He was also in the military but never used any of his reserve money. Child support was seen that and forced him to pay us. After a while, my mom grew tired of his games and hired a private investigator. She told him the whole story and wanted to know where he lived, where he worked, and where his family was. He found out, instead of my deadbeat father being thousands of miles away, he lived just a few blocks away and was living with his sister, the same one who wanted to meet me after 15 years, the one who wanted me to come over to her house for lunch. Now, you have to understand, my father once tried to run his truck through a brick wall in an attempt to kill my mother while she was still carrying me. He and his family have never even met me. They all left before I was born, but finding out that the same sadistic man was just a few blocks away made me feel unsafe for months. $500 later, all that was left was disappointment and uneasiness. Child support never got evidence of his residence or work. The private investigator was paid for his work, and we called off the job. Story 40. Not me, but my dad. My mom's been with many men. I could have told him myself, but I didn't want to hurt his feelings, and he wanted hard evidence anyway. Edited to add, if I remember right, it was 5 different guys at one time. One might have been the drug dealer, but he might have come later. It's been a while, and there was a lot to keep up with. The private investigator said, "I am sorry, you really got your money's worth." I had my dad's back twice by telling the guys she was married and that we all still lived together. Pretty entertaining breakups were my immediate reward. Not having to go with her to watch her date guys behind my dad's back was my long-term reward. Turns out, Dad doesn't have any biological children. Story 41. Our local radio station has a charity fund called Good Morning Angels, and they donate money to people in need every day, normally $2,000 daily to different people. A few weeks ago, a woman came on and said she had a disabled child in a wheelchair and an older child now in her 20s. Apparently, the father was sexually abusing both children until he went to another country for work. The listeners didn't believe the story, so the radio station decided to hire a private investigator to find out the real story. The investigator went to the country where the father was, and he didn't hesitate or hold back any information. Long story short, after lie detector tests and everything, it was revealed that the mother was using her disabled child, and the claim that the father sexually abused the children, which he did not, to get money, while the father was still sending them $3,000 every month from abroad. The father has now decided to divorce the mother, but I don't know what will happen legally. Story 42. My mom and I got into a big fight one day. She was verbally, emotionally, and physically abusive and manipulative. On this particular day, she told me to get the hell out of her home. I was so overwhelmed but didn't hesitate. I left the house in my old-as-heck car while a heavy storm was raging. She then came outside in the rain wearing just a long shirt and slammed her hands on the hood of my car, begging me not to leave. She's bipolar and has manic depressive disorder. Anyway, I backed out of the driveway and went to my crappy boyfriend at the time's house. She didn't know where he lived but guessed I was with him. She called my phone literally hundreds of times, begging me to come home and threatening to overdose on her prescriptions. It was all just an attempt to manipulate me, and she never actually tried anything. I stayed the night at my ex house and went to school the next day. My mom hired a private investigator to find me. Apparently, this guy sucked at his job. Somehow, he never thought to call my school. My mom didn't think I would be there. He also didn't see me walking to and from school to where my ex lived, which was literally across the street from my school. I don't know much more than that and never saw anyone. I went back home after 2 days because the woman my ex lived with told me to leave. She had 3 kids, 2 friends of the kids, 5 dogs, and probably 10 cats living there. She was a hoarder, and the house was infested with roaches everywhere, including inside the fridge and all over the food storage areas. It was absolutely disgusting. So leaving was both good and bad, I guess. Anyway, don't try to get the cheapest private investigator available. Story 43. I hired a private investigator after I found out my wife was cheating. I just wanted confirmation from a neutral third-party source because it was a big decision, and my ex claimed it was only an emotional affair. After 2 days, the investigator called me into his office and confirmed my suspicions. The relationship was physical and had been going on longer than she had told me. The next day, he called again and said, "Yeah, there's another guy she's still talking to." I ended up confronting my ex during our 3rd marriage counseling session and walked out. To get all this information, I handed over my old phone records back when they listed every individual text message and Facebook Messenger didn't exist, gave him my laptop for a day, provided a list of everyone we knew along with their phone numbers, and he searched her car for about an hour. He found a receipt for a contraceptive device and a pregnancy test that was a few months old. We didn't use contraceptive devices, and I'd had a vasectomy, so that discovery said a lot. We also gave him our daily schedules. Honestly, it was the best money I ever spent. Story 44. I didn't hire one, but my parents did. I was 14 and met another teen online. My parents knew if they came down hard or forbade me to talk to him, I would rebel big time. So they hired a private investigator and sat me down to tell me it was actually a 40-year-old man who had been grooming me and trying to lure me to his state. I am forever thankful they did that, and honestly, up until last week, I never told a soul this. But it came out in therapy, and I've started to heal and take my power back. Seriously. I can't say it enough. Parents, please monitor your kids' online friendships. Story 45. Another company was working on a job site. I had invested in a specific type of environmental cleanup company. One of the company's partners was kicked out and sued, and work stopped for a month. The client hired another company to finish the job, but they used our expensive equipment left at the site. The private investigator used a telescopic lens to take pictures of the new company using the equipment, so we could sue both the client and the new company. Story 46. He'd been tracked by a private investigator. Not sure what they found, but it couldn't have been interesting because it was never used. My ex-husband couldn't let go after I left and hired them. I'd find them on my front lawn in the morning, taking pictures of my car as I loaded it up. I'd see them follow me when I left the house. One even got onto the secure site where I worked and hung out at the smoker's spot, casually trying to listen to me chat with a coworker, because hanging out in a secure area with a group of regular smokers definitely doesn't look obvious. He even tried to get into the building. I reported it, but now I am permanently paranoid that people are following me. Freaking crazy ex-husband. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.